Hello everyone, I'm Dan Pinchbeck, I'm the creative director of the Chinese Room, and this is the Dear Esther Developers Commentary.
Hi, I'm Rob Briscoe, I'm the So you'll see around you in a lot of the environments, there's a lot of detail ingrained into everything. One of the things that I wanted to do with Dear Esther is bring the visuals up to the same kind of level of detail that Dan and Jess had put into the other areas of the game. So all of the history and the kind of hidden pieces of story that are intertwined with the VOs and the music and stuff, I kind of wanted to bring some of that into the environments. So if you look around you, you'll see that there's a lot of interesting...
Part of the point about the whole game, I think, was this idea that rather than having a linear, straight-through version of the story, that we could have multiple story units for each place you were, and I was really interested in this idea of how you can open up that space that people can interpret. So I loved the idea that you could have two people that had played this game and then would have a conversation about it, and one of them would say, oh, what did you think about when this happened? And the other person would be like, well, that didn't happen for me. I had a completely different event.
When I wrote the music for the mod of Dear Esther, there was absolutely no budget whatsoever for live players, so all the music was sampled. But one of the good things about that is it actually forced me to be quite creative about how I wrote the music. So with my background in...
Everything about Esther for me is a dream. The landscape is not an island, it's the dream of an island. The music is like music that you wake up because you've heard in your sleep, but you're not conscious of hearing it. And the language in the story was supposed to be like that as well. It didn't matter the sense it made, it was more about the kind of the shapes it created, if that makes sense. So that the words would kind of were like being in water, like listening to something underwater. It'd be this very dream. This symbol on the beach, which is the golden ratio, is one of the only things that's really left explicitly from the mod. In the original mod, there was an awful lot of more kind of symbols and kind of a much more kind of mystical, sort of magical element to the island. There was a lot of very weird stuff in there. And a lot of them came out of the commercial version because they felt like they were a little bit explicit. And instead...
So something I wanted to do as an artist was create some kind of reward for the player when they explore the island. There are some areas of the game where it's a little bit more quieter, there's no music or there's no voiceovers. So I kind of wanted to create a bit of an incentive for people to explore. And you'll find around the island that these kind of like random scattered items that are usually slightly out of place from the environment themselves, but in another aspect they actually bring a little bit of story to the island itself, usually to the island or to the actual protagonists or you know, the characters that surround it. So you'll find that around the island these little props and stuff. Just keep your eye out for it if you're exploring.
So people have asked why the Dear Esther's set on a Hebridean island. What's really interesting about this is it's one of those times when your kind of aspirations as an artist and the practical realities kind of dovetail. We knew that we had to have some way of limiting the player from disappearing off the play space, and when we made the original, it was a mod, and because it was a Half-Life 2 mod, you kind of had Eastern European city, spaceship, or blasted, desolate landscape, were your three options if you didn't want to start making any other assets. So it started off with these
One of the things you're always trying to do as a composer is create memorable themes. And a slight confession is that probably the most memorable theme, which is Remember in Dear Esther, wasn't actually created for the game. Rob's looking shocked. So it was actually from a piece of choral music that I'd written years before, based on a Christina Rossetti poem called Remember. And one of the things I was talking about earlier was how I didn't have any budget. So I had this piece of choral music And I thought, hang on, this is absolutely perfect for Esther, but I don't want to use all of it. So the only bit that you actually get.
White lines.
Yeah.
They actually did this. It was really cool. I found this historical document. They used to do this on Boré and the Hebrides. If the disease broke out,
Really?
they'd actually chip out and expose the chalk. So if you're on a boat and you were coming to the island, you'd know not to land because it was infectious, which is the coolest, most amazing. It's one of those things where you go, it's almost impossible as a writer to come up with something as cool as that. It just has to be something that was actually done. And it's so sad as well. And I love this bit and the fact that we can do it because it feels really real because it references a real thing. And I don't know, there's something really special about that. But it was always one of those bits in the game that I thought, we've got to be able to represent this somehow.
Something that I wanted to bring through in the art of the game was the same kind of fidelity that you find in both Jessica's music and Dan's writing. In the same kind of way that you have all of these little details, these very close attentions to detail that kind of really bring richness to the story, and something that was.
There's a scene in Donnie Darko where Drew Barrymore's playing his English teacher, and she talks about Celador as being the most beautiful word in the English language, and about it's the sound of the words together. And Dear Esther actually comes from the introduction to From a Faith No More song, the Crab song on the first album, Introduce Yourself. And there's a point where, I think it's Chuck at that point as the vocalist before Mike Patton, just says, Dear Esther. And it really lodged with me because the sound Dear Esther just has a really amazing sound to it. And I think when we started making it, and the idea of it being these series of letters to someone came through, it just came straight back out of going, that's just a really beautiful sounding combination of words. And I think that really sums up the whole approach to the writing in Dear Esther of what's a really... I think the central question to the entire experience for most people that have played it or are talking about it is this idea of, is the island real? Is what's going on a literal event of a man walking across a Scottish island, or is it a dream that he's had? Does the island even exist? And one of the things that we try to do with the writing is to constantly lull the player into a position where they got an understanding, they made a decision about what they thought was going on, and then to undercut it. So you never actually were able to settle on any one interpretation. And that was the challenge.
One of the things that's been most commented on with the audio and the music in Dear Esther is how sparse it is. And that was a really deliberate tactic. I wanted to leave room for the player to think and to dream and to wonder and to put their own interpretation into what was happening. And I think the problem with so much modern media is how bombarded we are constantly. It's the kind of MTV, flash in your face, constant music. And Dan and I watch a lot of drama together, and there really is constant
Endless,
music.
which is constantly telling you what you should feel, like really clearly, and it's like being kind of beaten up by the music sometimes.
And when you read a lot of reviews of Dear Esther,
So there's a lot of places in the game where you see a lot of strange things, and this is very deliberate. One of the things we wanted to do is just kind of like not spoon feed the player every little piece of story. We kind of just, some things are literally just in there to just kind of let you think and let you decide on whatever you want to bring to the story yourself. So it's kind of like I approached it like an impressionist painting where you've got like this kind of very vague outline of things, but if you stare at it enough, you can kind of like fill in the spaces, and kind of the image comes together on its own. So a lot of these kind of strange pieces of geography and stuff, that's really kind of deliberate in some ways, just to kind of keep the player's mind open and kind of bring their own interpretations of the story through that.
When I was originally thinking about how to write the music for the game, I suddenly realised that you don't see anybody in the game, and the most important character as such is the island itself. So one of the things that I did with the music was to write the island as if she or he were a character in its own right. And that's really important, I think, that you're going...
All right, let's talk about walking. Let's do it. We're gonna address the elephant in the room, the very, very slow-moving elephant in the room. So this might be a longer conversation because it kind of fits with that. So Esther was the first of the what are now called walking simulators, and it was really interesting that for us it didn't feel that weird to have a game that was slower than normal, where actually there was lots of time to just walk around and think and look at things. And it was amazing at the time how this was seen as completely revolutionary, and it's really interesting, and it's amazing to see how many other games have kind of like taken it on board. For me, it came from, I didn't see it as being odd to have a game where very little happened. The radio mast in Dear Esther was obviously there as a really important kind of design feature as well as its place within the story. And that, I think, came from, it was really interesting, it being a Half-Life mod to begin with, and the Citadel in Half-Life 2, that it tells you how far you are through the game. You're always looking up to the skyline, am I closer to the Citadel, can I see it? And it lets you know how near you are to the end of the game. And it was really important because Esther's so open in a way, and because there isn't this, you're not using kind of shootouts or kind of gating it with combat encounters to kind of constantly keep you moving. That it was really, really important that you always had that focal point of going, I know exactly from the beginning of the game, virtually right from the start, you know where you're going, you know where the game's going to end up, and you know that sooner or later you're going to...
So something you'll notice as you look around the environment is, you know, from a distance you see the landscape. It's kind of a beautiful place in some ways, but something I wanted to bring to the game was that there's this second layer beneath the surface, whereas if you look at things closely, you see that the actual island itself is very polluted. It's kind of very...
We cast and did all the voice direction for Esther ourselves for the mod, and it was basically Jess and I on a casting website just listening to people's show reels and finding what's the voice of this thing. And there was never any question about Nigel. I think we heard his show reel for the first time round. It's probably been listened to sort of 30 or 40 actors. And we started listening to his show reel and just both looked at each other and went, that's it, that's him. And it was amazing when Nigel came in, we had, I think, a day and a half to do the whole thing. And he just did that amazing thing that really, really great actors did. If he just walked in, got in front of the microphone, and more or less did the entire thing in one take. And we did hardly any retakes on anything. It just felt like...
So this hole in the ground was kind of a difficult thing in some ways. It's a bit of a challenging aspect of the game. Because, in some ways, it kind of like, I think for me, we wanted to have this kind of this pit here, and I wanted the player to be able to actually go as close as possible and like look over the edge and you know, kind of have this feeling of dread and stuff. But the other issue that we faced was like, what happens if the player just jumps into the hole? Like we have no real death in the game.
One of the really important jobs of a composer, I think, is to provide the player or the listener with different emotional tones and states. And up until this point in the game, the music has been very sparse, very intimate, and very isolating in a way. But the island is also a beautiful and magnificent place, and what I wanted to do at this point for the first time in the game is to create something that was really epic. So we go from that shift in scale where it's very intimate and small to suddenly realising that this is an extraordinary and magical place to be, as well as a difficult and quite sad and melancholic place to be. So the string players were instructed at this point to play with much more vibrato. Up until this point they've played in a very sort of Scottish style actually, no vibrato, very plain playing. But this was a really beautiful cue to write, actually, because that has that scale. You suddenly realise that the island is really big, and you have this beautiful vista, and the music then shifts so the player can actually, just for a moment, I think, enjoy being where they are.
Inside the bothy, there is a randomised chance that you can find an ultrasound picture on the table, and I think. So as you leave the bothy and the seagull takes off, that's the one jump scare in the game, which is kind of interesting because when we made it, we kind of had to, we kind of called it a ghost story, but there was no intention really. We kind of wanted this dreamy, hallucinatory type thing. But when it came out, people started coming back and saying, this game is absolutely terrifying. I was really, really frightened. And that was really amazing. And I think it's because nothing happens. We're so trained in games to go, there's stimulus all the time, that if nothing happens, you're waiting for something to happen. And kind of, I tend to go back to again and again, the whole sequence in Dead Space 2 when you go back to the Ishimura, and it's like
So one of the things that influenced the visuals quite a lot was the tech limitations at the time, and also the kind of themes of the game. Like, tech-wise, we were never ever gonna kind of achieve photorealism, and I think that was a good thing. I mean, really, it made us sort of stretch out into other areas, and for me as an artist, it kind of made me think a little bit more creatively.
We should probably talk about some of the inspirations behind it. I'm on a strict you don't talk about Stalker kind of thing going on here. But when Rob and I started talking, I think one of the first things that we kind of discovered was how much we're both obsessed with Stalker.
Yeah.
And I think that was one of the major things behind it in terms of when people talk about game inspirations. I mean, for me, there's a lot of FPS stuff in there, Doom, System Shock, but I think Stalker probably more than anything else. And Roadside Picnic, the Strugatsky novel that Stalker's based on, of the idea of this incredible space that you didn't understand, that's simultaneously beautiful and threatening. And I think sort of Tarkovsky's kind of films kind of play into that as well, particularly his version of Stalker, that you want to have this place that you feel rather than think about. And for me, that was like really kind of core to all of the inspirations for the game, was this is a space that is about feeling, not thinking.
Yeah, I think the movies in particular, I think I hadn't watched the movies. I'd read the book and I played the game, but when I watched the movie, it kind of all made sense to me, like why I like the game so much and why I like the story. It's just like every shot is like a painting. It's like every shot has its story to tell. There's very little dialogue in the actual movie itself. There's just these long lingering shots, and each shot is amazingly beautiful and in its kind of desolation. And for me, that was like a huge influence, like trying to bring some of that through into the environments. So that is definitely something I'm going to struggle not to talk about. But the game as well. I'd say the actual Stalker game has a big place in my heart, like gaming-wise. One of the more interesting and challenging things to do in the visual side of things is to kind of create an emotional connection with the player. With the music, it's very strong, and the dialogue can kind of help you to feel what the character's feeling, but to kind of really create an atmosphere and to create emotion, it's very difficult. So I designed a few things very subtly within the environment to kind of plant imagery into your mind and kind of make you feel
This is another of my favourite bits in the game, where you come along the edge of the sort of gully and you find hundreds of books, and it's one of the first times where most explicitly there's the suggestion that nothing you're seeing is real, because there's just no way that this can exist, and it's a really amazing, uncanny moment. But it works, I think, for me, because you just go, I don't...
One of the really important images in the game is the radio mast, and the soundscapes that I wrote for the game are really tied into this idea. So it's the concept of the tortured sounds that they're so broken down, they're so manipulated, and it really is supposed to represent the inner state of the protagonist at this point. It's that fractured understanding. So it kind of works on two levels, actually. We have the narrator who's trying to understand the journey that he's on, and we also have the audience's journey and their struggle for comprehension to understand what's going on in the game. So this distortion, this breaking down, this fragmented, kind of tortured sound really ties into the idea of the radio mast and that idea of communication, actually, that the game is trying to communicate something to you, the narrator's trying to tell you something, but it's so difficult to understand what that is.
The caves in the game are really interesting because it's a very tonal shift within the whole visual look of the game. It's kind of like this more organic, more surreal, dreamlike landscape compared to what you're used to before this point. It's we kind of used the visuals and this kind of unreal theme very subtly, but here it's kind of at the forefront. And it's, to me, has kind of been designed as this kind of journey through the inner self, through the body.
This, for me, is probably the most pivotal music cue in the game, and it's the one that most people write to me about to say that they are absolutely obsessed with and they love. It's the only music cue that has singing, it has a female voice, and I think that's a really important shift for me, that you've gone from this.
I just want to say that I think you can divide caves in games into pre and post Dear Esther. I think that it's just a way of breaking away from reality into saying what you can do with these spaces that actually makes them this incredibly, much more vividly colourful and much more kind of interpretative and look from it. And it's really interesting that I look at caves now in games and I find myself going, that's a very Rob Briscoe cave. And I think that's an amazing thing to have achieved. So I think it's one of those, it's great paying other people. I think when you're designing a game, it's very easy to get very locked into what the system can do. And you're trying to deal with all the different variations of things that if a player does this, then this. And we have to deal with the consequence here. And our lead designer, Andrew, and I talk about this all the time about you might have an idea, but then how does this radiate out throughout the entire system? And you get very caught in the idea of what the system has to be and how robust the system has to be and this kind of thing. And I think what's really important as a sort of a designer or as a creative is that understanding that actually the real game is happening in the player's head and that the system can be whatever you want it to be, but if the game isn't running in the player's head as opposed to on the screen, then you're missing a trick. You're not letting the game be everything it could be. And I think the great thing about working with a game as simple as Esther in a way is that those sort of consequences are playable. What's really important to me is that Dear Esther started out as a Half-Life 2 mod. And if the Half-Life 2 modding community hadn't championed it and celebrated it and downloaded it a lot and talked about it and loved it, then it would never have been a game. So it's never really bothered me, the kind of is it a game conversation, because as far as I can see it, Dear Esther and like everything that's come after it that's been inspired by it, this was championed by Hot.
Dear Esther was my first foray into writing music for games, and I actually approached it very traditionally, so more as a film score than a traditional interactive game music score. And what's really interesting for me is that the lack of interactivity in the music was never a problem for anybody that played the game. And that's a separate discussion, but there's a big schism between game music composers of how much the music should be following the player at all times in terms of interactive music. But one of the reasons I wanted to say something at this point was that
I don't know when the paper origami boats first came into things with Esther really, but it felt like a really amazing metaphor of taking these letters and folding them into boats and then letting them leave the island, because you know at this point in the game, it's kind of the realisation is there that this isn't going to end well, and that the narrator is never leaving the island. And the idea that this kind of, again, the idea of communication, or the attempt or failing communication, or trying to speak through the coma, or whatever it is, however you want to interpret it. But the idea of putting the boat in the underground river really felt like it kind of reinforced that sort of dream-like kind of quality of the caves, of actually there's something really sad about this one boat, because when you see it go past, you know that even the boats aren't going to leave the island. Like this is something which doesn't have a tidy, neat kind of like resolution. And there's, even if you don't sort of think about it to that sort of level of depth, there's just something, it's one of those things that I really love about games that you can do, where it's just a moment that has a really distinct emotional tone to it, that you go, there's a pause when you see that boat goes past, that I just think is, yeah, it's something special you can do with kind of media like games. In a lot of ways, the caves were the hardest area of the game to actually write, because we knew we didn't want to have much voiceover in there. I think because of the strength of the music, and this goes right back to the original mod, we wanted that to be the voice and for it to be a chance for Esther to speak rather than the narrator. And we also wanted to have this break, so when the narrator came out from the caves, you had a real definite sense of something happening, and that he had changed as a result of this journey. So it meant really felt wrong to have a lot of voiceover within there, but then that made it really difficult, because then it was, you had like...
The sound here is a classic case of, again, what music I think does really well, which is you've had this soft, lyrical, beautiful, epic, dreamlike music, and then the moment you come out of the caves, you're into this really harsh soundscape, and the tonal shift is very, very brutal, I think, and deliberately so. You have very little music when you come out of the caves. You hear the wind, and it's
This whole area moved, didn't it? The original mod, this was a cave right at the beginning of the caves where everything was written, and it moved to the back end of the level, and we had this long corridor that's full of these kind of it's the point of high madness, I think, in the game, isn't it?
Yeah, it's kind of just where you feel like you're losing the plot completely, both like visually and auditory, and you know, it's kind of like this really frenetic moment for me.
I think it's where you feel most that you're underneath a mountain, and you feel the weight of that mountain, and just I loved the idea when we were, you know, putting through it of what would it actually take to do this, like to actually paint all these symbols and what is going on. And it really is quite an explicit kind of thing of madness, of going, you would have to be insane or very, very disturbed to actually do this, and what is the process that this person's trying to work through, what they're trying to achieve by this. And I think it really strengthened it, making it a crawl through a tunnel as opposed to just a static location.
Yeah, I think it's the consistency and the coherence of the symbols.
This is a bit more of a contentious one because we disagree on this one. I struggle with this, with the points in the caves where you duck above and below the water, and you have to have that transition of audio. And I love the audio on both sides of the surface tension of the water, but I really struggle with you breaking water because it's such a hard edge to the sound, and I don't think there's any other way around that. And you need to have those moments where you do go underwater because it's so important. But it's one of the areas that's never sat very comfortably with me, because I feel like in a level which hasn't got a single edge in it, it's the one edge within it that breaks me.
And that's why I think it's so successful, because you've been lured into this completely hallucinatory, dreamlike world, and then all of a sudden, as a player...
The motorway scene, the biggest new addition to between the mod and the commercial version. This didn't exist. So the admission really is that I did play fast and loose with the geography of the M5. There isn't actually a welcome break service. It's just outside the junction of Sanford. But we also know,
pointed out to you.
Players. I mean, what a thing if you make something that's based vaguely on somewhere in real life. In terms of a compliment, when you're getting emails from players going, there isn't a welcome break there, and people really trying to work out where is this, and whole threads about where on the M5 it is. That's just the most amazing feeling. But I think what I really love what I think works really, really well in Esther, and again, it's something that I think is really carried forward to our other games, is that a lot of the time we're not dealing with kind of like big, glamorous, amazing, epic places. It's a sort of like a ratty little island in the Hebrides. It's someone who lived in Wolverhampton. It's just outside, you know, a service station on a stretch of the M5. And I think that earths what's going on. Gives it a realness as well, particularly when you sort of put it against the surrealness of the caves. Actually, you're kind of going, this is really surreal and this is really, really dreamlike, but actually I'm talking about, you know, a car accident just outside a little chef, and that playing off those two things against each other.
It's like making the ordinary extraordinary.
Absolutely, yeah.
This scene for me is like really, really iconic because it kind of brings this idea of the caves being an inward journey through the body together. It's really kind of like a symbol of rebirth, and it actually brings together a lot of the visual goals that I wanted to achieve with a lot of the symbolism in the game. Like, I've talked a little bit about how the environment was kind of designed to provoke emotions, and kind of the impressionistic style gives you just enough information to make you think of things and feel things. But this is probably like the antithesis of this. And the whole feeling of rebirth here is quite strong. I know Jess.
Yeah, the music's really supporting that.
Yeah,
because she sings always, always throughout, you know, we've got always, always, and then she sings never, and in a moment of absolute soaring, it's the climax of the music.
As you come out of the water and the music kind of swells, and you just kind of, it is like a moment of change has happened in some way, and I
think it's rebirth, isn't it? For me, it's his moment of clarity and acceptance and understanding of the reality of what's happened.
And you're literally moving towards the light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes.
You're actually doing that as you go through.
But the music, especially, I think before the music got layered in, that scene was nowhere near as kind of powerful for me. Like, that kind of just totally made it.
Dan and I had worked on lots of projects together, non-game projects, before we made Dear Esther. And I think the thing that links all of the projects that we've worked on together is that idea of hidden stories and layers of stories. And one of the things I wanted to do with the music was to embed hidden little hints and stories into it. So the music that you hear here has...
It's probably the level which has changed most from the original mod. I think it's much, much bigger than the final level in the mod. And one of the major changes in there is in the original mod, the whole side of the cliff face was covered in painting and writing, and a lot of that moved inside to that corridor in the caves where it's really obsessionally painted on. And it was really, we spent so long on that because we were trying to get it looking right, because it's one of those really interesting examples where I loved the image and the idea that you've got this guy painting the entire side of a mountain with words and symbols and things. But it was really interesting
one of the most fascinating things for me about planning this director's commentary has been that in previous years, when all the three of us have talked about Dear Esther, we've talked about the interpretation of the player. But actually going through this together, post having made it, we're still surprising each other.
Yeah,
and I think that's really, really interesting for me, because it shows that we left interpretation for each other and that we trusted each other actually just to get on with it. And because we each brought our own special and unique contribution to the game, we didn't have to, in a way, talk it to death or say you have to justify every idea you have or talk it to death or explain it. That Rob's idea that the island is very tainted and corrupt, and my idea that Dan didn't know that the whole level of the caves is a birth metaphor. I think it's really amazing that we're still finding out things about the game that we didn't know.
I think it was nice when I came onto it, because Dan was basically like, he gave me a bunch of materials, but he left me to my own devices for a lot of it, and we kind of like, I'd finish the level and Dan would play it and give me...
One of the really nice things about the move from mod to the commercial version is that we had a couple of years worth of the community talking about the game before we went back into it again. And one of the things that I read on a forum was that someone had constructed this amazing version of the story where they'd decided that the narrator was Paul. And I hadn't thought of that. It was never part of the original writing. And I thought, that's so amazing that as a writer, your audience can find something.
I'd been on holiday to Greece lots of times, and one of the things that I always really responded to emotionally was those shrines that you see on the road, and sometimes they're dedicated to saints, and sometimes they're to markate where an accident has taken place. So you'll get photos of the deceased person and flowers and candles, and they'd always...
One of the really nice things about the move from mod to the commercial version is that we had a couple of years worth of the community talking about the game before we went back into it again. And one of the things that I read on a forum was that someone had constructed this amazing version of the story where they'd decided that the narrator was Paul. And I hadn't thought of that. It was never part of the original writing. And I thought, that's so amazing that as a writer, your audience can find something in what you're doing that you hadn't thought of. So it was really important when we went back in to record the additional set of voiceovers. I thought, I absolutely want to do this. I want to take this idea that's come out of the fans and to run.
What's fascinating to me, Dan, is that you're an atheist, but each of the three games that we've made are so strongly about religion, either the language or taking allegories and stories. Why are you so drawn to it?
I think I'm really interested in people and the stories that make up people. And I think there is like in the Bible, like most kind of religious texts, it's not about what it is, it's about what is behind what it is. And that's what you're really getting to, is the idea of the sort of the parable or the metaphor. And it really felt like, particularly with Paul on the road to Damascus, is a story that many people know and we can understand, and it's about redemption and consequence and guilt and Is Dear Esther a depressing game or a hopeful game?
For me, it's kind of like a mix of both, really. I think, like, my interpretation is kind of like, always feel like kind of depressed when I think about the kind of turmoil that this guy's been going through for God knows how long, and the kind of environment he's been in, and all these events surrounding his story. But for me, I always feel...
So Dear Esther is the first walking simulator. How do you feel about Walking Simulator?
You know what, I think I took offence to it when it first became a thing, but I think actually I don't mind it so much now. I think the fact that we have kind of taken ownership over it, like that genre has been kind of made our own by not just our game, but like a bunch of different games have kind of embraced it. I don't know, what do you guys think?
Well, I'm still really confused about the need to categorise in games, probably more than any other creative.
There's a bit of an illusion of simplicity with games like Dear Esther that people kind of assume, because there's not a lot of mechanics and there's not much going on in that sense, that they're easy to make. And I think actually it's kind of the opposite in a way, that because they're so simple, everything is exposed and everything has to be exceptionally good for it to work, because you're carrying a player's experience on a fairly sparse, minimal kind of framework, and that really means that every aspect of it has to be produced at a really high quality and has to be done with a lot of passion and a lot of thought. There's nowhere to hide in a game like Esther, and that's something which I think carries through to the best games of this type. You can see with all of them there's a real commitment to kind of depth and a really intelligent way of approaching design, and a real kind of trust in the player and a real assumption that players are smart, imaginative. The last level ended up being quite a lot bigger than the original mod, and it's also the one where actually the movement around it is in a way the most artificial. There's the big zigzagging cliff path that basically it's like a series of straight lines from point to point. There isn't a lot of movement, and one of the things that was really difficult to do with that was to not make it feel too much like a corridor and to give it that sort of sense of space and that you were actually exploring somewhere quite natural. I think, Rob, there was stuff which you put in there, like little new beat moments, like the ruins at the edge of the cliff, that just helped the. There's a bit of an illusion of simplicity with games like Dear Esther that people kind of assume, because there's not a lot of mechanics and there's not much going on in that sense, that they're easy to make. And I think actually it's kind of the opposite in a way, that because they're so simple, everything is exposed and everything has to be exceptionally good for it to work, because you're carrying a player's experience on a fairly sparse, minimal kind of framework, and that really means that every aspect of it has to.
One of the things that I think was added more frequently in the final version of Dear Esther was the inclusion of a number of ghosts in the game. These are not like ghosts that you'd see in a normal horror game. They're just very loose silhouettes that you will see around the island, usually like quite a distance off, or just kind of somewhere that you'd barely see it out the corner of your eye. I think this is a good example of where it's kind of really in your face, and these are kind of just something that we put in to kind of not just bring some unreal elements to the island, but something supernatural as well, something that.
The overlook, the point about this to me is that it's probably the voiceover in the game that kind of sums up the whole story and the experience. It's almost like a recap of everything that's gone before you start the final climb. And you know it's that pause before you're going to start the final climb and before the game's kind of builds to a climax. But you can also see the whole level, and it's like the idea that you are standing looking down on your own journey, a bit like the idea of your life flashing before your eyes, or sort of like seeing your body but having an out-of-body experience at the moment of death. And it was really designed to try and get that feeling as the player, that you stop and you take stock of everything, and there's a bit of a sense of there's no going back. You take a breath and now it finishes. And I really wanted to kind of achieve that sort of sense, and I think we did.
So here it kind of the environment becomes a little bit more surreal again. We kind of play with the colors a little bit, bring up the saturation. It's kind of a little bit of a return to some of the more cave-like aesthetics in terms of colors and stuff like that. And it's kind of there to kind of signpost another significant moment in the game, or something that's leading up to the significant moment. It goes back to this kind of idea of having these emotional signposts in the visuals of the game, without it being overly obvious, and some of that.
The music that's playing here is a repeat of another cue, and originally we hear it played on the piano, and the string quartet take on the piece here. And it's one of those really nice instances where we were in the studio and I had this idea of how it was going to sound, and I thought it was going to be quite full and rich and, full-bodied. And then one of the string players said to me, "This is right."
It was possible that this last section of the game could have felt quite laborious and forced, because it's two long zigzagging paths that just go up, and there was a real importance to getting it right, and quite a lot of work went into it. I think at this point for me, you probably as a player understand that the narrator's going to die at the end. and that this is it. And that unlike where the rest of the island, there's this sense of this could just keep going on forever and ever and ever, and you're going to keep
With the climb being quite a poignant moment of the game overall and of the story, it was quite a difficult task to try and make that climb still interesting and not too laborious, because it's kind of this zigzag up there with nothing really. There's no real environment. You just kind of have the sea on one side and the cliff face on the other. So there was quite a lot of work that went into kind of building up this feeling of tension as you're rising and kind of making this moment as poignant as possible while still making it interesting. So a lot of effort was put into building up this weather, building up the winds and the swaying of the grass and kind of the volume of the soundscapes and everything mixing together with the music, and just kind of visually really trying to make this a tense moment. And I think it's hopefully been pulled off all right. And you'll notice when you get to the top, this kind of tension dies, and that's very purposeful. You'll see no more wind. It's just kind of like a symbolic thing where you're coming to the last moment, the point of no return, and that's been very deliberately designed that way.
We had a lot of debates, didn't we, about the ending of the game and whether the player should retain control or whether it was okay to go to a cutscene at this point. I personally don't mind it. I actually actively like it because I think it works really well as a metaphor for loss of control at that point. Dan, I know you're not as keen.
Yeah, I'm not. I would have loved the player not to have had control taken away from them, but to me it was a balance between two evils. The evil of having a cutscene and the evil of the player accidentally falling off the ladder halfway up and destroying the ending.
Yeah, I agree. I think we tried a few different things, and the tech at the time just wasn't, the ladder tech at the time just wasn't there. So, and the other thing for me was pacing. It was making sure all the music, the voiceovers, the timings and everything were perfect for that final jump off point. And just letting the players kind of noodle around going up a ladder for what may have been like 7 minutes, because it's a tall tower, was kind of an impossible task.
One of the things that I enjoyed the most on working on Dear Esther was Rob's beautiful visuals were so inspiring, but Dan's words are always so amazing to write to. I think that's where we start as a partnership. And the music at the end was so easy to write because that last voiceover is the pinnacle of the writing to me, as it should be, because it's the last VO, so you would have failed if it wasn't good. But it is just so beautiful and moving. And for me, talking about whether it's a hopeful ending, the music is really hopeful at this point. And it signifies to me transformation, freedom, escape, acceptance. Yeah, and it was just a beautiful cue to write, actually.
I don't know, I can't remember quite where it came from in the mod, but the moment when we went, or we could put the bird in there and you could see the bird's shadow, and actually it turned from being kind of like a straightforward literal suicide into a metaphorical, or to my mind, kind of like, I always really believed the narrator did turn into a bird just before they hit the ground, and that was really important. I think it's probably the strongest ending in any of our games so far. But yeah, I'm very proud of the way everything came together in that last section.
Yeah, I think it's the bird thing is particularly interesting because I think it was in the original mod, but the timings and everything were just all off, and you never really saw the seagull. Yeah, at least the shadow as well. It was all kind of like a little bit broken. And I remember when we went back in, I made a real effort to try and get that shadow just out of the center of the view. So you kind of have this hint of something happening, and I think you can hear the sound of a seagull flapping its wings. It's like very subtle, but like I say, I kind of really like the way that came together. It's very, like say, it's kind of like a release, but at the same time, there's still this kind of ambiguity there that's kind of beautiful.
And I'm really proud that I got the monitor in at the end for an ending of, it goes into the, hospital monitor signifying the flat line. And I think it's it's one of those moments where you never want to be so clever that people notice it and it takes them out of the moment, but it just flows in through the music, and it just feels like everything comes together at that last point. That last VO, Rob's amazing visuals and the music, and it feels like a really, really strong and beautiful ending.
And then in the last second, Nigel Carrington's delivery of just those two words have come back, where he just pitch perfect.
Yeah. So that's the end of the director's commentary. We'd just like to say a big thank you to everyone for listening. We hope you've uncovered some secrets and some facts that you didn't know about the game before.
We'd also like to say a huge thank you for buying the game, and for all our fans who've been behind us and been behind the game and have kept it alive all these years. It's a real privilege that it's still out there, still such a title that people love so much.
Yeah, and we're really looking forward to the future and what we can create coming up next. Thanks for listening.
Cheers.
Bye.
Dear Esther, the morning after I was washed ashore, salt in my ears, sand in my mouth, and the waves always at my ankles, I felt as though everything had conspired to this one last shipwreck. I remembered nothing but water, stones in my belly and my shoes, threatening to drag me under to where only the most listless of creatures swim. Donnelly reported the legend of the hermit, a holy man who sought solitude in its most pure form. Allegedly, he rode here from the mainland in a boat without a bottom, so all the creatures of the sea could rise at night to converse with him. How disappointed he must have been with their chatter. Perhaps now, when all that haunts the ocean is the rubbish dumped from the tankers, he'd find more peace. They say he threw his arms wide in a valley on the south side, and the cliff opened up to provide him shelter. They say he died of fever 116 years later. The shepherds left gifts for him at the mouth of the cave, but Donnelly records they never claimed to have seen him. I have visited the cave and I have left my gifts, but like them, I appear to be an unworthy subject of his solitude. When you were born, your mother told me, a hush fell over the delivery room. A great red birthmark covered the left side of your face. No one knew what to say, so you cried to fill the vacuum. I always admired you for that you cried to fill whatever vacuum you found. I began to manufacture vacuums just to enable you to deploy your talent. The birthmark faded by the time you were 6 and had gone completely by the time we met, but your fascination with the empty and its cure remained. Dear Esther, I found myself to be as featureless as this ocean, as shallow and unoccupied as this bay, a listless wreck without identification. My rocks are these bones, and a careful fence to keep the precipice at bay. Shot through me caves, my forehead a mount. This aerial will transmit into me so. All over exposed, the nervous system, where Donnelly's boots and yours and mine still trample. I will carry a torch for you. I will leave it at the foot of my headstone. You will need it for the tunnels that carry me under.
A wonderful sight. The moon cresting the junction between the cliff path and the stone circle. It cast a shadow of the ridge across the beach, all the world as if you had signed your name in untidy handwriting.
When someone had died or was dying, or was so ill they gave up what little hope they could sacrifice, they cut parallel lines into the cliff, exposing the white chalk beneath. You could see them from the mainland or the fishing boats, and know to send aid or impose a cordon of protection, and wait a generation until whatever pestilence stalked the cliff paths died along with its hosts. My lines are just for this: to keep any would-be rescuers at bay. The infection is not simply of the flesh. We are not like Lot's wife, you and I. We feel no particular need to turn back. There's nothing to be seen if we did. No tired old man parting the cliffs with his arms. No gifts or Bibles laid out on the sand for the taking. No tides turning or the shrieking gulls overhead. The bones of the hermit are no longer laid out for the taking. I have stolen them away to the guts of this island, where the passages all run to black, and where we can light each other's faces by their strange luminescence. Dear Esther, I met Paul. I made my own little pilgrimage. My Damascus, a small semi-detached on the outskirts of Wolverhampton. We drank coffee in his kitchen and tried to connect to one another. Although he knew I hadn't come in search of an apology, reason or retribution, he still spiraled in panic, thrown high and lucid by his own dented bonnet. Responsibility had made him old. Like us, he'd already passed beyond any conceivable boundary of life. I find myself increasingly unable to find that point where the hermit ends and Paul and I begin. We are woven into a sodden blanket, stuffed into the bottom of a boat to stop the leak and hold back the ocean. My neck aches from staring up at the aerial. It mirrors the dull throb in my gut where I am sure I've begun to form another stone. In my dreams, it forms into a perfect representation of Lot's wife, head over her shoulder, staring along the motorway at the approaching traffic in a vacuum of fatalistic calm. The vegetation here has fossilized from the roots up. To think they once grazed animals here, the remnants of occupation being evidence to that. It is all sick to death. The water is too polluted for the fish, the sky is too thin for the birds, and the soil is cut with the bones of hermits and shepherds. I've heard it said that human ashes make great fertilizer, that we could sow a forest from all that is left of your hips and rib cage, with enough left over to thicken the air and repopulate the bay. Dear Esther, I have now driven the stretch of the M5 between Exeter and Bristol over 21 times. But although I have all the reports and all the witnesses and have cross-referenced them within a millimetre using my Ordnance Survey maps, I simply cannot find the location. You'd think there would be marks to serve as some evidence. It's somewhere between the turn-off for Sanford and the welcome brake services. But although I can always see it in my rear-view mirror, I have as yet been unable to pull ashore. I've begun to wonder if Donnelly's voyage here was as prosaic as it was presented. How disappointed not to have found the bones of the holy man. No wonder he hated the inhabitants so. To him they must have seemed like barnacles mindlessly clinging to a mercy seat. Why cling so hard to the rock? Because it is the only thing that stops us from sliding into the ocean, into oblivion. There must be a hole in the bottom of the boat. How else could new hermits have arrived? I had kidney stones and you visited me in the hospital. After the operation, when I was still half submerged in anesthetic, your outline and your speech both blurred. Now my stones have grown into an island and made their escape, and you have been rendered opaque by the car of a drunk. What charnel house lies at the foot of this abyss? How many dead shepherds could fill this hole? I've begun my ascent on the windless slope of the western side. The setting sun was an inflamed eye squeezing shut against the light shone in by the doctors. My neck is aching through constantly craning my head up to track the light of the aerial. I must look downwards, follow the path under the island to a new beginning. The bothy was constructed originally in the early 1700s. By then, shepherding had formalized into a career. The first habitual shepherd was a man called Jakobsen, from a lineage of migratory Scandinavians. He was not considered a man of breeding by the mainlanders. He came here every summer whilst building the bothy, hoping eventually that becoming a man of property would secure him a wife and a lineage. Donnelly records that it did not work. He caught some disease from his malcontented goats and died 2 years after completing it. There was no one to carve white lines into the cliff for him either. When the oil lamps ran out, I didn't pick up a torch, but used the moonlight to read by. When I've pulled the last shreds of sense from it, I will throw Donnelly's book from the cliffs and perhaps myself with it. Maybe it will wash back up through the caves and erupt from the spring when the rain comes, making its return to the hermit's cave. Perhaps it will be back on the table when I wake. I think I may have thrown it into the sea several times before. In a footnote, the editor comments that at this point, Donnelly was going insane as syphilis tore through his system like a drunk driver. He's not to be trusted. Many of his claims are unsubstantiated, and although he does paint a colourful picture, much of what he says may have been derived directly from his fever. But I've been here, and I know, as Donnelly did, that this place is always half imagined. Even the rocks and caves will shimmer and blur with the right eyes. They found Jakobsen in early spring. The thaw had only just come. Even though he'd been dead nearly 7 months, his body had been frozen right down to the nerves and had not even begun to decompose. All around him, small flowers were reaching for the weak sun. The goats had adjusted happily to life without a shepherd and were grazing freely about the valley. Donnelly reports they hurled the body in fear and disgust down the shaft, but I cannot corroborate this story. Climbing down to the caves, I slipped and fell and have injured my leg. I think the femur is broken. It is clearly infected. The skin has turned a bright, tight pink, and the pain is crashing in on waves, winter tides against my shoreline, drowning out the ache of my stones. I struggled back to the bothy to rest, but it has become clear that there is only one way this is likely to end. The medical supplies I looted from the trawler have suddenly found their purpose. They will keep me lucid for my final ascent. From here, this last time, I have understood there is no turning back. The torch is failing along with my resolve. I can hear the singing of the sea creatures from the passages above me, and they are promising the return of the gulls. I first saw him sat by the side of the road. I was waiting for you to be cut out of the wreckage. The car looked like it had been dropped from a great height. The guts of the engine spilled over the tarmac, like water underground. I am traveling through my own body, following the line of infection from the shattered femur towards the heart. I swallow fistfuls of painkillers to stay lucid. In my delirium, I see the twin lights of the moon and the Ariel shining to me through the rocks. This cannot be the shaft they threw the goats into. It cannot be the landfill where the parts of your life that would not burn ended up. It cannot be the chimney that delivered you to the skies. It cannot be the place where you rained back down again to fertilize the soil and make small flowers in the rocks. wish I could have known Donnelly in this place. We would have had so much to debate. Did he paint these stones or did I? Who left the pots in the hut by the jetty? Who formed the museum under the sea? Who fell silently to his death into the frozen waters? Who erected this godforsaken aerial in the first place? Did this whole island rise to the surface of my stomach, forcing the gulls to take flight?
I returned home with a pocket full of stolen ash. Half of it fell out of my coat and vanished into the car's upholstery, but the rest I carefully stowed away in a box I kept in a drawer by the side of my bed. It was never intended as a meaningful act, but over the years it became a kind of talisman. I'd sit still, quite still for hours, just holding the diminishing powder in my palm and noting its smoothness. In time, we will all be worn down into granules, washed into the sea and dispersed.
There were chemical stains on the tarmac, the leak of air conditioning, brake fluid and petrol. He kept sniffing at his fingers as he sat by the roadside, waiting as if he couldn't quite understand or recognize their smell. He said he'd been travelling back from a sales conference in Exeter. He'd stopped for farewell drinks earlier, but had kept a careful eye on his intake. You could hear the sirens above the idling traffic. From here, I can see my armada. I collected all the letters I'd ever meant to send to you, if I'd have ever made it to the mainland, but had instead collected at the bottom of my rucksack, and I spread them out along the lost beach. Then I took each and every one, and I folded them into boats. I folded you into the creases, and then, as the sun was setting, I set the fleet to sail. Shattered into 21 pieces, I consigned you to the Atlantic, and I sat here until I'd watched all of you sink. I will drag my leg behind me. I will drag it like a crumpled hatchback, tires blown and sparking across the dimming lights of my vision. I'm running out of painkillers and am following the flicker of the moon home. When Paul keeled over dead on the road to Damascus, they restarted his heart with the jump leads from a crumpled hatchback. It took 21 attempts to convince it to wake up. I've begun my voyage in a paper boat without a bottom. I will fly to the moon in it. I've been folded along a crease in time, a weakness in the sheet of life. Now you've settled on the opposite side of the paper to me. I can see your traces in the ink that soaks through the fiber, the pulped vegetation. When we become waterlogged and the cage disintegrates, we will intermingle. When this paper aeroplane leaves the cliff edge and carves parallel vapor trails in the dark, we will come together. If only Donnelly had experienced this, he would have realized he was his own shoreline, as am I. Just as I am becoming this island, so he became his syphilis, retreating into the burning synapses, the stones, the infection. Returning to my car afterwards, hands still shaking, and a head split open by the impact. Goodbye to tearful aunts and traumatized uncles. Goodbye to the phenomenal. Goodbye to the tangible. Goodbye Wolverhampton. Goodbye Sanford. Goodbye Cromer. Goodbye Damascus. This cliff path is slippery in the dew. It is hard to climb with such an infection. I must carve out the bad flesh and sling it from the aerial. I must become infused with the very air. Drunk, Esther. He was not drunk at all. He had not drunk with Donnelly or spat Jacobson back at the sea. He had not careered across the lost shores and terminal beaches of this nascent archipelago. He did not intend his bonnet to be crumpled like a spent tissue by the impact. His windscreen was not star-studded all over like a map of the heavens. His paintwork etched with circuit diagrams, strange fish to call the gulls away. The phosphorescence of the skid marks lighting the M5 all the way from Exeter to Damascus. Run out of places to climb. I will abandon this body and take to the air.
Dear Esther, I have burned the cliffs of Damascus. I have drunk deep of it. My heart is my leg and a black line etched on the paper all along this boat without a bottom. You are all the world like a nest to me. Eggs unbroken form like fossils, come together, send small black flowers to the air. From this infection, hope. From this island, flight. From this grief, love.
Dear Esther, I have now driven the stretch of the M5 between Exeter and Bristol over 21 times. But although I have all the reports and all the witnesses and have cross-referenced them within a millimetre using my Ordnance Survey maps, I simply cannot find the location. You'd think there would be marks to serve as some evidence. It's somewhere between the turn-off for Sanford and the welcome brake services. But although I can always see it in my rear-view mirror, I have as yet been unable to pull ashore. Dear Esther, I have lost track of how long I have been here and how many visits I have made overall. Certainly the landmarks are now so familiar to me that I have to remind myself to actually see the forms and shapes in front of me. I could stumble blind across these rocks, the edges of these precipices, without fear of missing my step and plummeting down to sea. Dear Esther, I have now driven the stretch of the M5 between Exeter and Bristol over 21 times. But although I have all the reports and all the witnesses and have cross-referenced them within a millimetre using my Ordnance Survey maps, I simply cannot find the location. You'd think there would be marks to serve as some evidence. It's somewhere between the turn-off for Sanford and the welcome brake services. But although I can always see it in my rear-view mirror, I have as yet been unable to pull ashore. I had kidney stones and you visited me in the hospital. After the operation, when I was still half submerged in anesthetic, your outline and your speech both blurred. Now my stones have grown into an island and made their escape, and you have been rendered opaque by the car of a drunk. What charnel house lies at the foot of this abyss? How many dead shepherds could fill this hole?